Welcome everyone to the Global Markets Encounter. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the globe. And Jim, I see your picture there. Good morning to you also. Yes, your microphone, yes. So before I get back to Jim, I would like to appreciate our sponsors and partners. And here we have GIZ.com Cashew, Intersnack Procurement, Pro Cashew, TechnoServe Benin Cashew Project, Cashew Info, SNI, and Mayor. Also to some housekeeping matters, please, we are coming to you live in English and French. And to select your choice of language, please use the interpretation button at the bottom right of your screen. We also have the Q&A button, which will allow you to put in your questions, and then please feel free to use the chats for your networking. Again, I would like to also mention that we are live on Zoom, where we are now, but then we also have others on Facebook, YouTube, and Microsoft Teams. Today's topic is more on reviewing the markets and the 2021 season. And to do that is none other than Jim Fitzpatrick, who already is on and waiting. And he will be looking at reviewing what has happened since the break, looking at the different markets, and then bringing us what dynamics are at play now since we last looked at the global market. But Jim, I already have two questions that have been mailed to me even before we start. And the questioners are asking that we look at where we are now compared to a year today. Because a year ago, the person was saying we're looking at stock holding, huge levels of stock holding in different countries last year. And then also the incidence of COVID in Asia, and altogether what impact it was having on the global markets, especially for cashew. And so for you to address and let us know where we are compared to a year today. And then the second question is asking, what is the outlook for the cashew season in the East African region? So I think these are two questions that you already touch on as you do the presentation for today. So thank you and welcome, Jim Fitzpatrick, and pleasure having you always. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernest. Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you again. We are going to talk about those exact two subjects today. We're certainly going to talk about the impact of COVID. And of course, we have to have a look at East Africa and the rest of the world in the context of Southern Hemisphere crops already started. But before we do that, I'd just like to invite you to get involved. Join in, ask questions, add to any talking points. You're very welcome to discuss any aspect. Use the chat, raise your Zoom hand, talk to us and interact. That makes it all the better an event. Whatever your opinion, let's hear it. So we'll talk about this by method of, we'll go through a few talking points of this season and we'll have an outlook to the end of the year. So we'll start by, let's go back to the last event that we had of this sort. And the last time I was with you, we were talking about the prospects for July to December 2021. And that was back on the 14th of July. And we left off by saying that the RCN supply was likely to stay tight. And that's been relatively accurate. It does remain somewhat tight. We said that the kernels market would remain quite steady and an upside was possible. And although the market starts to look soft in the last 10 days or so, it did move up in the interim. We talked about the freight costs and how that might be a limiter on the upside of the market at the time. And I think that's probably proved to be relatively true. Perhaps people might have bought more and shipped more if they could have got the containers and if they could have got freight rates that were a little bit more reasonable than some of the really high rates being asked at the moment. And we asked the question at the time, in mid-July, remember, is it possible for RCN holders to squeeze the market? And we were thinking mostly about Vietnamese processors at that time. That still remains a question mark. It hasn't really happened. And the reason it hasn't really happened, I suspect, is that as we thought might happen, COVID grew and became a major factor in Vietnam in recent months. And if we just go back and have a look at the chart, this is the cases, 7-day average cases in Vietnam. And you can see when we talked 14th of July, cases were just beginning to turn. And as unfortunately is pretty predictable with COVID, cases exploded after that. And thankfully now, back on their way down again. And there seems to be some control in Vietnam again. At the time, we also said that there might be a third wave in India. That wasn't my estimation. That was the estimation of some of the Indian experts. But fortunately, that proved to be wrong. And we're in a situation now where COVID, although there are some cases, particularly in southern India, it does look to be nothing like the peak that was there during May and June. So when we look at that, we see a market that's been, for the time of year, quite active. Cashews are often active from the end of August through September into early October, and the market has been quite active. But the impact of COVID in Vietnam has been perhaps to keep the market a little bit calmer than it might otherwise have been. So that leaves us with some talking points. And what we're seeing in the last, I suppose, 2 weeks, 10 days, 2 weeks, is prices of kernels have started to ease a little bit in Vietnam. Very much depends on the type of processor, the level of certification, the quality of the processor, and the processor's reputation. We've seen that exports remain very strong. And we know that the supply-demand balance has something wrong with it, at least on the official figures. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit this morning too. Why are prices falling? Well, the old thing that people used to say, there's more sellers than buyers. And that's probably the case. But there's probably more sellers of smaller processors, maybe with some kind of a stock built up, than there would be of the top class certified processors. And that may be the reason that we're seeing the market slipping a little bit in Vietnam. Buyers too shipped early. They bought early, shipped early because they anticipated these very long voyages. We heard during the African Cashew Alliance conference from Wim Schipper of Intersnack that they were experiencing voyage times of up to 65 days from Vietnam. So you need to buy early if voyage times are that long. So therefore, we're not going to see a lot of additional activity, I think, in the coming weeks, at least not for the busy season. That business is long done in the international market. Talking point two is this very fact. Freight, it's still a problem. It's a system that probably has been on the edge for many years. We see the impact of the pandemic to push it over the edge, and a situation now where containers are difficult to find, but not only containers. Trucks are difficult to find in Europe and North America. Trains are difficult to find in North America. Ports, containers, cranes, you name it, is a problem at the moment. And it's a particular problem in cashews, as we know, because freight was, over many years, a very small part of the cost of buying a cashew kernel, somewhere around about 2%. And now that's trebled, it's up around 6%. And freight rates themselves are absolutely skyrocketing, maybe 10 times what one would have been paying 2 years ago for a 20-foot container from Asia into a European or an American port. If we look at demand, demand remains pretty resilient. Vietnamese exports are up by 20%
Hello,
for
Jim.
the year so far. Yeah.
Hello, Jim.
Yes, Ernest.
Let me cut in briefly. The interpreters cannot hear you. So if you can check, I can hear you clearly, actually. So maybe a few seconds. Let's see whether they get the feed well. So just a few seconds pause for us.
Sure.
Hello, Jim. Please, you can go ahead now. It's all sorted. Thank you. And sorry for the interruption here.
No, not at all. It's good for me to catch my breath if I'm out full of coffee. Think about it a little bit. We were talking about demand, and demand is definitely steady. Demand is not up as it was last year. Demand is actually maybe slightly down in the West. Its imports are down a little in Europe. That shouldn't be interpreted as weak demand. Last year was a very different year. Similarly in the United States, but exports from Vietnam are strongly up. And reconciling these two factors is quite difficult. We'll have another look at that in a while. Finally, the talking point at the moment is Southern Hemisphere crops, and we'll have a look at crops in East Africa, and we'll have a talk about a little bit about the crops in Brazil and the long-term trend there. So let's try and position the market in terms of history, and let's have a look at prices. So as you can see, current prices slightly off the top of the recent highs. The market had been working its way up and had been reasonably steady between April and September. It's drifted off a little bit now, only on pressure, selling pressure from Vietnam. And it is always interesting to notice in Vietnam that when there's a change, when COVID came in, first of all, there was almost panic selling, crashing prices down to unrealistic levels. Then when the crisis started to hit in Vietnam itself, about 13 months later, same thing happened. Early new crop this year, again, a little dip in price, always pressure from Vietnam. Now, that's because Vietnam dominates the market, but it's also because of, I don't really understand it, there's a certain reaction in Vietnam. If we look at Broken's prices, the two bottom charts are splits is the upper one and large pieces is the bottom one. My version of large pieces is large white pieces, the superior grade. That's the one I use. And we can see that the trend over the past year since the market bottomed out is for Broken's to catch up again. And that's reversing a trend that goes back all the way back to October 2018. So when we look at this situation, we're looking at a market that reached its high for the period post, I almost said post-apocalypse, but post the 2017 incredible upward rise in prices. The recent high 345, and that was reached in September 2021. The low of the market was last year, twice in May and August. $2.75 a pound for 320s. I always use 320s as the benchmark grade. I think most people do. When we look at that, we see a market that is, we shouldn't necessarily say stable, but within a range. And it's in a manageable range. And that range over the last 4-5 months or a little bit longer is pretty good news, because price stability or relative price stability is good news for business. If we look at this market in very trying times, there's no doubt that the costs, freight and other costs have gone sky high. And that's definitely going to put a brake on Kernels prices for the immediate future. If we look at the prices of raw cashew nuts, we can see again that this season, particularly in West Africa, was a season of rising prices. The season does always tend to finish on the highs as the product starts to run out. But this year it started quite low and moved up throughout the season. And if we try and benchmark that, we've reached prices which are again back at levels of December 2018. So it would seem that the period of decline in prices, which was much longer due to the impact of the pandemic. So I think most people, if we go back, cast your minds back just over a year, back to February, March 2020. And at this moment in time, most people were anticipating that prices would start to move up a little bit. And we anticipated that prices would start at the closing price of the previous year, which they did, and then move up maybe in the type of pattern we've seen in this year. That was, of course, absolutely stymied by the pandemic, more by the uncertainty of the pandemic in the beginning, and prices stayed low during the year. But it does seem now, by the end of the 2021 Northern Hemisphere season, that trend has been reversed and the market is back into what might be a more expected pattern. So we see the season finishing on the highs, at least the Northern Hemisphere season, finishing on the highs. And we see inventories of RCN, we're talking about here, don't forget, in relatively strong hands. So it's unlikely that we're going to see high stocks of low quality at origin flowing onto the market at the beginning of next season. If there is a carryout from 2021, it will be in the hands of traders who will be relatively strong holders of the product. We'll see just how strong in the next 2 or 3 months. We look at the start of the season in East Africa, we see that prices are starting quite high. We see Tanzanian prices quoted. Now, I think we have to take this with a little bit of a warning. Tanzanian prices before the auction tend to start very high. Speculators offering at high levels, trying to set a tone for the market to see how they get on. But that's what we've got to work with right now. That has dropped down by about $50 over the past 2 weeks as the auction approaches. And we're back to levels again that we haven't seen really since the end of December 2018. The 2019 season started with a kind of a false market and rapidly dropped off in price into 2020. So it looks as if we will see prices starting at high levels. And if you work out the calculation, if you take the RCN, take the yield, take the cost of processing, it's quite difficult to see how these current prices would be sustained in Tanzania. And the big factors would be whether or not Vietnam comes into the market and just how slow will shipments be. We'll have a look at the Southern Hemisphere crops to try and maybe answer some of those questions. So in the Southern Hemisphere, we're looking at about 18 to 20% of the world crop harvested during October to January. Tanzania offers the largest crop during that period. This year, that's forecast around about 260 to 280,000 tons. I think we have to treat that with some caution. The 280,000 tons is probably more a target than a forecast. Hopefully, we would see that target met. The Brazilian crop is lower than expected, or lower than hoped for, perhaps. Again, in a pattern of decline of production in Brazil. Mozambique looks like a very good crop. I confess to being puzzled by the estimates that come out in Mozambique. I see official figures around 160,000 tons. I see figures from other organizations around 85,000 tons. I personally end up being somewhere in the middle, but on the lower end of that. And I hope to get a chance to reconcile these figures someday, but I just can't figure out how there's 160,000 tons, and if it is there, where it goes. Indonesia looks like a normal to good crop, nothing particularly different to report there. Seems to me that if I add all of this up, taking Mozambique at the more modest estimate, it looks like Southern Hemisphere crops, despite the problems in Brazil, up by about 10%. Doesn't have a huge impact. We're only talking about maximum 20% of the world crop. So a 10% increase overall represents about 2% increase on last year. Let's have a look at Tanzania. You can see that the pattern in Tanzania was very positive all the way through probably to 2018. We've seen that interrupted in recent years. We've seen a very poor crop in 2020, and we saw a lower crop in 2019. The estimate for this year would be a 25% increase on the poor 2020 crop, but around about the same size as the 2019 crop. The auctions are scheduled to start on Friday. There are offers in the market. They started around $1,600, maybe even higher. At the moment, the offers are around $1,525. I haven't heard of any business. I expect $1,525 to probably be a little bit too rich for most buyers, who will tend to be Indian buyers, and we could see prices a little bit lower than that. There have been some interesting and positive changes in Tanzania over the past year in terms of the cashew sector. I think that the fact that processors can now access the supply of raw cashew nuts directly through primary cooperatives, through farmers associations, I think this could be a game changer. It could be a game changer for processing in the country, not only giving access to processors to raw material without all of the complications and high cost structures of the auction, but also giving the opportunity for those processors to build relationships with farmers, improve quality, and possibly in the future help with the distribution of inputs. There's definitely a genuine government support for the development of processing in Tanzania. There seems to be a reform of the input system, and we read of some discussions regarding a contribution, a levy contribution on the trade in raw cashew nuts toward the input system. The input system is critical for Tanzanian production. Tanzania has very good cashew trees, very good varieties, high quality cashew nuts, a lot of farmers, a lot of suitable land, but the control of pests has been a problem for many years. And in years when the inputs are well distributed, they tend to get a good crop. In years where that system breaks down, which it has done frequently over the past 10 years, you get a poor crop. So this year, optimistic forecasts, and I think you would tend to feel more optimistic about the Tanzanian sector today than at any time in the past 5 years. It does look again as if something might happen. Sadly, we've seen many false dawns in Tanzania over the years. Let's hope this isn't another one of those. There is one other factor to mention, and that is that shipments this year will be exclusively through Mtwara. Last year, Mtwara handled, I think it was about 180,000 tons of raw cashew nuts. So it is possible. However, I find it a pretty strange thing to do at a time when the general freight and logistics system around the world is under pressure. So it does seem to defy logic that you would not leave the system more flexible at a time of strain instead of trying to push everything through the port of Mtwara. I could understand doing that at a time of easy logistics, cheap freight, but at a time of difficult logistics and high cost freight, it's hard to understand that particular decision. So I'm wondering if that might cause shipments to come out of Tanzania more slowly, something which would already have been a fact, regardless of whether or not 2 or even 3 ports were used. Something to watch, and it could have an impact. It could have an impact in India, particularly, where buyers will need to buy more raw cashew nuts and are certainly set to buy more raw cashew nuts and would normally favor Tanzania. The final factor I'd mention on Tanzania, it does look as if there are significant processing projects now in the pipeline, and real projects too. For a long time, we've heard of 40,000, 50,000 ton factories being built by various organizations and never happening. I've been listening to that, I think, since 2012. This time, it seems to me that it's happening. There are some processors in the country, and there are now some projects that look like they will actually achieve large-scale mechanized or semi-mechanized processing. Let's have a look at the Brazilian situation. So unfortunately, this year, the Brazilian crop is forecast lower, about 11, almost 12% lower than last year, which itself, as you can see, wasn't a particularly great crop. This is the forecast of the IBGE, the Government Agricultural Forecasting System, and is normally fairly accurate. Hectares, the fall in the number of hectares has been stopped. The number of hectares planted to cashews actually rose slightly over the last 12 months, but exports continue to be at a relatively modest level. I mean, back to 2009, and Brazil had a 12% share of world cashew production. At that time, of course, the crop was much lower. Ivory Coast was 14%, India was 28%. And when you look at it today, Brazil's share of production has dropped down to 4%. African countries generally have increased their share, both in East and in West Africa. And we see a situation where Brazil, although it is still a supplier of kernels, about 15,000 tons of kernels exported to mainly to Europe and North America in 2020. That is a much lower figure than going back to 2008, when they exported 35,000 tons. And there are a number of factors there. There are fewer processors, there's a lower crop, and there is bigger domestic consumption. So what was a real giant of cashews back in 2008, 2009 has declined. And after 10 years of static to declining crops, it doesn't look as if that situation is going to reverse. So those are the major crop areas. I'm going to come back to Mozambique during our next event when I get some more input on that, and perhaps we'll invite someone from Mozambique to come on and chat to us about the crop prospects there. If we look at demand, well, I'll start with two of the major markets, and the US market this year is looking pretty good, actually. So the red bar is the cumulative imports. That's why it builds up steadily throughout the year. And this is a comparison of 4 years, 18, 19, 20, and 21. So what we've seen throughout the year is that in 2021, imports were not keeping up with 2020. That is until July. And in July, we saw this major catch-up situation. We saw I think it was 20,300 tons import into the United States in July. And that was a catch-up on what had been going before, but it was also no doubt in anticipation of the risk of COVID in Vietnam and the risk to logistics as the busy season, the Thanksgiving, Christmas, Super Bowl season approached. So as we stand at the end of July, imports have caught up again, having been below 2020 in every month up to July. We're now slightly up on the year. That's the latest official figure. It's likely to continue around about that level, I think, but we should expect that exports will drop off a little bit in Vietnam as an impact of COVID. But let's put some perspective on that and compare 2021 to 2019. And there we see a slightly different perspective. If you compare 2021 imports to the United States to 2019, it's up 18%, showing pretty strong underlying demand. Similar situation. So this is Europe, a similar chart rather. This is the European Union plus the UK combined. And here you see the gray bar is the cumulative imports for 2021, and the lines are the previous 4 years. Again, we see a situation where European imports are slightly down on 2020. You can see that here. And they've pretty much been in that pattern throughout the year. We had seen, whereas we saw the very strong imports in July in the United States, we saw strong imports in June in Europe a month earlier, which probably reflects a slightly earlier reaction, a slightly earlier season, and a slightly shorter transit time. A year ago, European imports were up by 17% on 2019. Now they're slightly down on 2020, but still ahead of 2019. Well, I think what we can conclude is that the impact of the pandemic, particularly on the logistics and freight, has taken a toll, number one. Number two, that 2020 was in so many ways a different year, not only for all of the obvious reasons, but also for demand in our favorite product, cashew nuts, and that we're seeing something of a correction. But there may also be an element of uncertainty around how markets will behave post-pandemic. The pandemic isn't going away anytime soon, but businesses are definitely thinking about how will these markets look after the pandemic has passed, whether they should buy forward, what levels of inventory should be held, what are the chances of a return of the pandemic, a fourth or a fifth wave. How possible is that? People may be looking back and thinking about 1918 and remembering that that lasted 3 to 4 years, albeit without medical facilities and vaccines that we have today. So there may be some doubt on that. I would not be particularly expecting an increase. If Europe manages to maintain the trend that it's on up to July for the rest of the year, it would be really good going. And then we'll have a look and see what forward buying looks like for the coming year. Chief amongst our talking points has to be this logistics situation. I've referred to this already quite a few times. And we have a highly interconnected system. We have, on any given day at the moment, around the world, about 300 container vessels waiting to be discharged. And we've a very particular situation in cashews. I mean, we have this high dependence on a single origin, on Vietnam, which shares shipping lanes with China, other Asian countries, lanes to the west coast of the United States, to Europe, and to the east coast of the US. We have obviously major freight disruptions, maybe not necessarily up to July due to problems in Vietnam, but certainly due to problems in China. We have an origin in Vietnam that itself imports 80% of its raw cashew nuts, and which had largely escaped the worst impacts of the pandemic until the end of July, but since then has suffered badly. And it's by no means clear that there won't be further impact of the pandemic on logistics, on freight, and on processing too. So we're looking at a situation where the management of the supply chain, the just-in-time system, the minimum inventory, long supply chains, even the idea of fixed price forward contracts is all been thrown into question through the impact of the pandemic. And it's not only asking the question about a pandemic, but also whether or not the supply chain is fit for purpose and whether or not other types of problems can arise to cause disruption. And that asks a lot of questions for African businesses, particularly African processors and governments, as to how they can maybe take advantage of these changes or set the environment right so that the cashew sector in those countries can develop. So this is not going away anytime soon. There are maybe at the moment, people are seeing some, let's say, green shoots, if you like, freight rates have stopped going up for the time being. There seems to be easier availability. It's hard to know whether that will continue. If you talk to shipping lines, they seem to be a little bit more conciliatory on rates, but not necessarily optimistic on voyage times, container availability, and all of the other issues. And don't forget that it's not just ships and containers, it's also trucks, trains. The whole logistical system is under pressure at the moment, and this needs to be watched. I've mentioned this before, as you know, if you've been with us. I mention it again because I'm a little bit alarmed to see it being talked about at the moment as something that's over. This is not over. This is going to continue as a problem for some months to come. So let's focus in then on the situation in terms of shipments, and let's have a look at Vietnam to start with. So exports of cashews from Vietnam have been remarkably positive in 2021. Here we have a chart month by month, exports of cashew kernels in tons, and the bar represents the volume for any given month. Dark blue is 19, light blue is 20, and the red is 2021. And you can see month by month, we have a very strong performance throughout the year. Only in February did we see a situation where exports from Vietnam were lower than in the previous year, but they were still well ahead of what had happened in 2019. That's back in February. There does appear to be something of a slowdown in July and particularly in August. And it's interesting to look at how that might happen. So if we look at June and July, we're talking about months when you can get shipments to Europe, shipments to the United States, which will be there in time to meet the very busy period, September, particularly October, November, and December. 65 days from the end of June brings you into September. Add another 45 days onto that, October. So really, we probably should expect shipments to markets in the West to ease off, and it wouldn't be surprising if we were to see this red bar, exports from Vietnam, at fairly modest levels once we get into shipments for October, November, and December. Again, highly influenced by perhaps the anticipation of COVID problems in Vietnam. There were inklings of that, signs in June, but particularly in early July. And secondly, what we've been talking about, freight, logistics, and all of those cost pressures and problems that have beset the market over the past 2 years. We shouldn't forget India. Quick look at Indian cumulative exports, and really we see the trend in India set. Exports this year are just very slightly above last year's level, but compared to any of the previous 3 years, back to 2017 in this case, India has definitely stopped being a major exporter, and there's no significant reason why that should reappear in the market anytime soon. There may have been this year a number of buyers who sought to buy Indian cashews, perhaps paid higher prices for Indian cashews in order to offset their risk of shipments from Vietnam, or at least to spread their risk. But it doesn't look as if there's any significant pattern, nor that anyone is looking at India as a solution. Don't forget that the Indian domestic market is way above the international market, 40, 50 cents per pound on 320s, more on brokens, and that market is unlikely to be concerned with export business anytime soon. So as it stands, the market remains and is likely to remain dependent on Vietnamese cashew kernels unless African processors know different. And the situation in Vietnam is by no means clear. And when we look at the figures, so now I'm going to talk to you about official figures, published figures from Vietnam and elsewhere. And if we were to work this out, we would see Vietnam's imports officially quoted at almost 2.4 million tons, compared to a crop probably somewhere around about 300,000 tons this year, a lower crop than you would normally expect. And that would give us an availability of product for processing and re-export in Vietnam around about 2.4 plus 0.3, 2.7 million tons or thereabouts. If you take that, convert it back and look at exports, bearing in mind that Vietnam is firstly not a major consumer of cashew nuts. There is cashew consumption in Vietnam, of course, but it's not a major consumer, not in the way that India is, for example. And secondly, that most of the trade today is documented and recorded in the export figures, unlike years ago when the border with China would be at times relatively easy to cross without being documented. So if we look at it, we take the imports plus the crop, that gives us our total availability. Take some out for domestic consumption, take the rest out for exports. On paper, at least, that would give Vietnam about 6 months stock. Vietnam processes about 182,000 tons of RCN every month. That's what will be left. So the question is this correct? Is there really 6 months supply of RCN in stock and more on the way? And if we look at imports into Vietnam in the period January to August, so this is January to August for 6 years compared, and you can see the January to August figure for 2021 is around about 140% of the January to August figure in 2020. And we didn't run out of cashews in 2020. And we didn't find prices going through the roof at the end of the year. So something's clearly wrong. What seems to be wrong is the import figure from Cambodia. There may be a number of different things that are wrong, but this seems to be the obvious answer. If we look at it and if we say that the Cambodian crop, which is recorded imports into Vietnam of 1.1 million tons so far this year, which is not correct because clearly the Cambodian crop is not 1.1 million tons. And I know this, I'm heavily involved in the industry in Cambodia. There's three figures. There's the Vietnamese import figure, 1.1 million tons. There's a Cambodian export figure, 865,000 tons, I believe. And then there's a kind of a calculated trade figure. So just for the sake of the discussion, let's say that the Cambodian crop was as it was expected to be, as it was originally forecast, and as seems probably likely. This is where imports would be. Imports are still way ahead of last year, way ahead of 2019, in fact, at an all-time record. Question is, where is that stock? Is it real? Where's the error? Has the stock been used? Who owns it? And these are the main talking points for Vietnam. So as we look at the situation now, we have to first of all ask the big question for Vietnam, and that's about COVID. Can it be managed at relatively low vaccination levels? At the moment, as of the 3rd of October, 11 million people were fully vaccinated in Vietnam. And despite strong efforts to get it right, that's still a relatively low number, about 10% of the population, compared to highly vaccinated countries, the highest is about 90%. Small countries generally up around that level. In general, around about 60%. 80% is said to be the level at which the virus can be controlled. So the first question is, can the virus be controlled at that level of vaccination? We can't answer that, but we need to keep an eye on it. Secondly, what is the actual inventory of RCN in Vietnam? What will processors do now? We've seen them, some of them at least, wanting to sell. Will they start to try and sell off any inventory they have? Will they maybe try to correct their cash flow? Will they buy RCN that's lying in warehouses in Vietnam? Will the holders of the RCN, and there are some major holders of RCN stocks, will they be able to hold the market? So will they be able to keep prices? They would have paid what looked like quite high prices compared to the value of kernels. And we've seen that the season prices moved up throughout the season. So will the holders of RCN be able to hold the market at a level which allows them to orderly market their inventory and make money out of that? That's a question. And that largely depends on how much inventory they actually have. And it's very difficult to estimate that. We all have our own views on this. Whatever way you look at it, it would be a high level of stock. Whether you believe the Cambodian figures or not, it still would be quite a high level of stock compared to previous years, despite high levels of exports from Vietnam. And if we look at the situation, we need to put it into the context of the facts. Exports are at a record level. Imports are at a record level. And exports have held up even through a very difficult period when we had strong restrictions in some parts of the country. If we look at the Indian situation, again, we're now looking at Indian imports. And we see Indian imports, the latest official figures are for July. And Indian imports for July, for the entire year so far, are ahead of previous years. And that's a good indicator that demand is quite strong in India. It may be slightly distorted as we get into August, that the imports may be slightly higher because there would have been, I presume, I don't know for fact, but I presume there would have been shipments diverted to India that were originally intended for Vietnam. And those may be lying in India, either in bond or imported. But what we are seeing is that if you look at the orange bars, that Indian imports are ahead of previous years. So that's a good indicator on demand. It does appear that the much feared and much talked about third wave, the last time when we spoke together on this event, there was a lot of talk about the third wave, and that doesn't seem to have materialized so far. In fact, although India, if we think back a year ago, India was affected, severe lockdowns, severe COVID cases, but was just coming out of that as the festival season approached. Indian demand is quite seasonal, and the Diwali festival toward the end of the year is a very important time for the consumption of all products, but particularly cashews. And the question now is, how will demand fare during the season? This year, as we enter that season, the lockdowns would be much less. There are fewer cases, and they seem to be much more located in certain areas. And the situation in India has developed. So if we look at the imports so far, and I'm not going to take too much gossip, so I'm only looking at the July figures because we know those are correct. So Indian imports up about 10% on last year. And last year was a pretty good year, well ahead of the 2019. Exports, as we said earlier, slightly up. Looks like domestic demand is steady in India. That should lead to good interest from Indian buyers in East African and Indonesian crops. I think that the Indian buyers will not be rushing to the market in Tanzania. I see no reason for them to do that. But they should need to buy more products. So it wouldn't be surprising if Indian imports in 2021 reached a figure round about 850, 860,000 tons, maybe slightly less than last year. But that would indicate good interest for the Tanzanian season and eventually for Mozambique raw material from India, but that may come a little bit more slowly and a little bit later than you might normally have expected. Let's have a look at some of the talking points for the African cashew sector. And we talk about the way that the pandemic has changed the way buyers look at the supply chain. And I've just reproduced there. That was a slide that we used back in one of these events earlier in the year. And we talked about how the pandemic had changed the way people look at the supply chain and the way they talked about risk. And actually, when you think about it, really what it's done is it's perhaps accelerated some of the trends that were already there. People were looking for more traceability, transparency. They were looking to develop greater supply chain integration. And perhaps this has shown some of the risks and maybe accelerated some of the trends. Questions for Africa are, can these trends be leveraged? Can they lead to better opportunities for African value addition, African processing, and of course, production? Question for governments is, are they putting in place an environment which enables the development of cashew nut processing? Does the regulation facilitate more processing? It could be incentives, that maybe is part of it, but also the general business environment. And if we look at, for example, the case of Tanzania we mentioned earlier, if we look at that and we look at the access now of processors directly to growers, it's certainly a situation where that system starts to change. And maybe, as I said, maybe that becomes a game changer. And the question is, and this is really what we've seen this year. So this year and in the end of last year, we saw a situation where some processors benefited hugely from their ability to access the supply chain. They benefited from the opportunity to offer to kernels buyers shorter supply chains, certified products, high quality, full container loads of different grades. In the coming years, will this just be those few that have the ability, the money, the capacity to do that, or can this become a general trend? It's quite possible that you get this phenomenon, you get some success stories and everyone sees that's the winds of change. A few success stories, but it's also quite possible that they become just islands of success that stand out simply by the fact that their businesses work. And if we look, for example, in West Africa in 2021, there are definitely some very good examples of success stories, without a doubt. But there are also unfortunate examples of factories that haven't managed to keep working. Factories, in some cases, that have never worked. Projects that have had fortunes spent on them and never come to fruition. And perhaps these are areas that governments also need to focus on, so that one successful factory does lead on to further success, and not, as has often been the case, unfortunately, in the past, that those factories just stand out like unusual examples of success. Will this be more widespread this time around? Other talking points in Africa, and we talk about talking points that have arisen in the course of this season. And we look at Cote d'Ivoire, pretty successful season for export. More bigger deals. How did they work? How did those big deals impact the overall situation? How did those bigger deals impact the supply chain? Maybe they actually made life more difficult for the national processors. If we look in Guinea-Bissau, we have to ask the question, is there a production problem emerging? Is it the age of the trees? Is it climate change? Or is it just a cyclical thing that will in time correct itself? All of those gains for processors, can they be maintained? That for me is the biggest question. So I know of maybe 5 examples of processors that have been hugely successful in the pandemic, mainly due to their good setup and their good management of it. Can this be spread? Can this be sustained elsewhere? Questions focus again on Tanzania because it is that time of year. And the questions, the big talking points for me, will the direct sourcing by processors from farmers change the sector? Will this bring in further investment? Will this be something that becomes more and more attractive to investors? It should, if it's managed well. And secondly, can this inputs distribution system be fixed? Can it be sustainably fixed? Or is this, again, just a situation where, as we say here, the can has been kicked down the road? In other words, the problem is just being pushed along without being really resolved for the long term. Talking points for Africa, and I suppose I want to go back also back to the ACA conference this year. So a very interesting event, and if we talked about regulation and policy at that time, we talked about all different kinds of policy initiatives, and generally what we found was that production initiatives worked. They were largely effective. I mean, when we look here on this matrix, if it's in blue, it's effective. If it's dark orange, it's relatively ineffective. And so what we saw was quite a varied impact, but generally a very positive impact on production initiatives. When we looked at the RCN trade and the regulation of export, we saw things like exporter registration, export windows, improvements in the post-harvest infrastructure, drying, warehousing, bagging, export duty and taxes, which are present in most countries. We saw some examples of warehouse receipt systems, especially in Tanzania. And we saw initiatives to link farmers to processors and to exporters. And when you look at them, exporter registration is really worthwhile and successful, has a positive impact. Export windows, really is a question mark over export windows. An export window is when you're only allowed to export raw cashew nuts during an approved period, usually meant to be after processors have purchased their stock. In some cases, particularly in East Africa, this means that that stock of RCN comes to the market too late, after it's needed, perhaps encourages smuggling. And there's a big question mark over whether that works or not. We know from evidence in Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, and elsewhere that post-harvest infrastructure development really is effective. Good drying and bagging and storing of cashew nuts makes a huge difference. Export duties. Some countries have very high export duties. Some countries have low export duties. 1 or 2 countries have no export duties. There's always the question on these, who ends up paying it? Markets are markets. And is this duty reflected all the way back down to the farm gate? And is it really, the question that's often asked, is it really the farmer that ends up paying that duty? And that's by no means clear. And there's a lot of discussion on that, not only in cashew circles, but elsewhere. Generally, we've seen that warehouse receipt systems, auctions, and holding systems have not worked. And not only in cashews, but elsewhere too, in other products. And finally, the linking, and for me, this is probably the biggest thing that makes a difference, is linking farmers to exporters, linking farmers to processors. Developing an integrated supply chain has a hugely positive effect. And finally, our final talking point on policy is policy and regulation on processing. And if we look at it, you have a whole range of different supports. And what we can see in particular is that the supports that worked best, and this we have to go back a little bit in time, but if we look in Vietnam over the past 20 years, if we look in India over a much longer period, good market information, good technical support, which means training, support with equipment, development of technology, and access to finance and financial services. These were the things that fueled the development of the Vietnamese cashew industry. That, plus a lot of hard work, a lot of good entrepreneurial spirit, built a phenomenal industry. And we look at, in Africa at the moment, we're looking at policies which are attempting to create similar development. Technology actually doesn't need to be developed. It is already developed. It's available from India, it's available from Vietnam, it's available from China. Is it available in Africa? And will it continue to be available? Is a major question. So whether or not we can take for granted that the technology will be available needs to be looked at. We're looking at various policies to develop processing direct subsidies in Côte d'Ivoire, which absolutely has stimulated the development of processing. Will it sustain the development of processing remains to be seen. So we have a whole range of factors. And if we look at the three areas, if we look at things like export windows, which really haven't been shown to work that well, we looked at retention of particular volumes of the crop, which I think is very difficult to regulate. There's a question mark over that. We look at the direct subsidies, which initially have had a very positive impact, but the clock is ticking. How long can they be sustained? How are they paid for? Do they work? Do they attract the right kind of investors? So overall, the questions still remain outstanding for African countries in terms of policy, in terms of regulation. And these should be big talking points during these coming months, particularly for West Africa as the 2022 season approaches. So we started by looking at a review of what we'd seen as the outlook for July to September. And I'll finish by just giving you some idea of my thoughts on the October to December period. I think the RCN supply is likely to stay pretty tight. I think the raw nuts that are around are probably needed. That doesn't mean that prices will stay high. I'm talking about the availability of product. I think that the kernel market could go a little bit quiet. Prices could come under a little bit of pressure. That largely depends on the patience and the reaction of Vietnamese processors to the current situation. It may also depend on the confidence of buyers, particularly in Europe and the US, as they look forward into 2022 and what they think may happen, and whether or not they feel they'd be better to wait or better to buy something forward as the year progresses. Seems to me that the freight costs will stabilize. They may already have stabilized. That's not to say that they're cheap, they're not, but they're stable at least. But the disruption will continue. Big question is probably, will the Tanzanian crop find a market? It will eventually find a market, but when will it find a market? Will it find a market within the next 3 months, as you'd normally expect? That's a huge question. Longer term, post-pandemic, and this is looking well into the future. how likely are buyers of kernels to continue with their high dependence on Vietnam as a single origin? In other words, will there be an opportunity for African processors to develop? And it seems to me that if African processors can offer an alternative, buyers will be quite happy to take that up. That's been shown over the past 18 months. But that means that aligning processors' capabilities with buyers' needs. In other words, food safety, taking advantage of traceability, access to logistics, and particularly what seems to be largely neglected as far as I can see talking to people is good marketing communication. The development simply of talking to customers, good sales approach, communicating the benefits, communicating whatever makes a business unique to buyers is at times sadly lacking. And finally, we shouldn't assume that COVID is gone. We shouldn't assume that the impact of COVID is gone. We should be vigilant, obviously in our personal day-to-day practices, but also in our businesses. We need to keep a close eye on this. It would not be at all surprising if there were to be further waves of COVID particularly in countries where vaccination levels are low, but also in countries which have high vaccination levels where perhaps the number of hospitalizations or deaths is reduced, but the number of cases goes quite high. And we see that at the moment in some European countries. So it's not gone away. I still think that we're looking at 3 months of relatively challenging 3 months, and probably a further year that'll be quite challenging. I think that we're looking at a situation where probably we're not going to see further upward pressure on prices over the coming 3 to 5 months. But at the same time, I don't really see any reason why prices should decline. But watch out for the reaction of particularly smaller and mid-sized Vietnamese processors. They have developed a habit of pushing prices down. At the moment, it wouldn't be logical to do that, but it is possible. I think RCN, there's big questions around about the inventory of RCN, and there is at least some of the ingredients for yet another big change in the structure of RCN trading around the world. And it'll be interesting to see how that develops. So thank you very much indeed. I hope you found this useful. It's my pleasure as always to talk to you. And I'll hand you back to Ernest. Thank you, Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. Let me show my video also, and then engage the participants. And I'm also asking participants, please, you can put in your questions using the Q&A button. And then you can also raise your hand. There's the hand feature in there if you want to talk directly and to exchange with Jim Fitzpatrick. And then, Jim, there is a number of questions that have come in from the other platforms. I think the first one has to do with your statement whether or not fewer, bigger export deals are making processor supply chain developments difficult. I think you have mentioned it somewhere under one of the talking points. And then you also had asked in terms of outlook whether Tanzanian crop will find a market. And here the question is, the questioner wants to know actually that in 2018, 2019, Vietnamese companies signed large value direct contracts with private enterprises and states in Africa. Did we experience this trend in 2021? And how much of a risk are these large contracts to producing countries? So, Jim, if you can take the question also to clarify a bit the two issues that you had raised in your presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, I think what I would say is that large contracts effectively transfer risk from the buyer of the RCN to either the local exporter, the co-op, or even in cases the government in the exporting country. So that means that short position or that risk is transferred. Now, obviously, a buyer of large volume contracts can negotiate a more attractive price and perhaps more attractive terms. So I think what it does is it creates pressure back into the supply chain, where you have one very large contract that must be filled. It will be a major problem if such a big contract was not filled. It must be filled, and it must be filled within a set time pattern. And that causes, or can cause, a disruptive supply chain. It can cause an inflation in RCN prices, even for a few weeks. And I think we did see that in 2021. And I think that transfer of risk is something that we could say, on the one hand, is a transfer of risk to organizations which may not be used to managing such risk and may not be capable of managing such risk. And that can be a disruptive factor on the entire supply chain. It is true to say that we did see large deals done in previous years. I think, though, in Tanzania, let's remind ourselves that those large deals were mainly the result of the fact that the crop had not been marketed. These were not large deals done at auction. These were large deals done after the auction system had broken down. And that the large deals from Tanzania were almost, and I don't want to be too dramatic, but I'm just going to say almost distressed, in the sense that had those large deals not been done, it's quite likely that the stock would have moved much more slowly. And also bear in mind that the shipments made against those contracts were tended to be used as a strategic stock, which tended then to have an impact, a knock-on impact down the line into West African prices. So I think that we have to, seriously consider the impact of these large deals. I'm not saying there's anything right or wrong about doing a large deal. What I'm saying is that when it happens, we have to consider the impact and how that might change the supply chain, and particularly how it might make sourcing or supply chain development for processors more difficult. So the point is, on the one hand, we say, here's incentives, here's subsidies, here's a retention of a percentage of the crop for domestic processing. And on the other hand, we facilitate trading measures that are counter to those factors. So we have to ask, are we wasting our money by doing different things at the same time, which offset each other? And I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. What I'm saying is we need to think about how these things work and understand the market. And I think also that we should remember that the buyers of the RCN at the other end are often not entirely happy with the way the trading system currently works. And don't forget that you can say, clearly you can say, well, that's kind of their own fault because they haven't engaged with the supply chain and they haven't, let's say, gotten involved with supply chains in African countries. And that might be right, but it doesn't change the fact that these large deals have a big influence.
Thank you very much, Jim. I know you have touched on the issue of inventory remaining after the West African season. But then I've been reminded again by the questioner that they want to know what is the estimate of stock actually on the continent in West Africa, and to what extent can that impact on the season that is started in Tanzania, or let's say East Africa generally?
Well, I think the best evidence is of shipments. I don't think that we're looking at a particularly larger than normal inventory left in West Africa. I think that we are possibly looking at now as slower shipments, but most of the inventory is probably committed at this stage. I don't think it has a huge impact. I think that what's left to be sold or shipped or is afloat in West Africa probably goes to Vietnam, and that the main buyer for Tanzania and RCN this year will be India. So I don't think it's going to have a hugely negative effect.
Jim, the next question has to do with the 3 months of COVID in Vietnam. Obviously, your presentation showed that it is a situation that is going down. It's in the top of the peak, and it's declining currently. But how much has it impacted on the volumes processed in the last 3 months?
Well, factories were definitely operating under reduced capacity. So there's no doubt that when we look at the measures undertaken in the factories, that it will have impacted production. Particularly when you look at a situation. So if you have a situation for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and we had situations where workers, management couldn't leave factories, and mechanisms, systems were put in place to facilitate them staying in the factories. Obviously, the longer that goes on, the more difficult it becomes to maintain. We should say that the cashew producing and processing areas were not the worst impacted areas. The major cities, particularly Ho Chi Minh City, was the worst impacted area. So the figures so far in terms of the actual export of kernels tells us that the impact was relatively light. That's not to say that the cost was relatively light. It's not to say that the efforts to keep processing going were not phenomenal. But what it does say is that they worked. And so I don't think that there's, on the basis of the figures, now we cannot know the inventories in individual factories, but we do know what the export figures are, and those remain quite positive. And based on those, we would have to say that processing has fared reasonably well in Vietnam. And that is probably a function of large factories. So you would imagine that most of the processing has been carried out by the larger factories, well-managed factories, mechanized factories where these kind of systems are possible. Is there a huge inventory waiting to be shipped? I don't think so. Is there an inventory waiting to be shipped? There is. And this is one of the reasons why we see kernels prices softening, I think.
Okay. But linked to this is also the question on the platform here on Zoom as to how much of our CN stock you estimate is already in India, and whether it is sufficient for the requirements, and or your analysis of it currently.
My analysis of that situation, and this is, analysis is too grand a word for this. Let's call it just an estimate. Imports are up, as we know, on last year. Demand is good. Therefore, it seems that the Indian cashew sector is adequately supplied for the time being. Imports at the end of July were 558,000 tons. Probably means there is about 300,000 tons still to be imported. That would be, let's say, normal average kind of import. So I'm suggesting there's no shortage of raw cashew nuts in India. There's no shortage of raw cashew nuts likely to emerge in India. There's no sign that there'll be any panic buying, for example, or any desperate Indian processors coming to the market. So I don't expect any particularly aggressive buying actions from India.
All right, so let me shift to a slightly different topic. The questioner wants to know whether it is not better for African governments to tax raw nuts than subsidize kernel exports. I mean, whether it is not, isn't it better for African governments to tax raw exports than subsidize kernel exports? Your views on that also?
Well, I think that there's a question, the question that arises when you talk about export taxes is who actually pays the export tax. So if you take and there's various ways of looking at this. If you take the market and say, look, this is the market, and processors are going to pay that price in the market because that's the market price. And then one country has an export tax of 18% and another country has an export tax of 3%. It comes back to a market price. So the argument in that case would be that effectively the export tax is paid by the farmer. In other words, that the market will always adjust. So in that case, it would be the taxing of export of RCN could place farmers' incomes lower than they otherwise would be. If we look at a situation where let's say, for example, we had a harmonized export taxation system, then the product would tend to trade according to the market value back to the farm gate related to the availability, quantity, and quality. It is, of course, very difficult to analyze this because different countries have different qualities of product. It would be in a very general statement, and I want to underline that this is a very general statement, but it would appear to be that in countries where export taxes are higher, that farm gate prices are lower. And that would generally seem to be a trend. Now, whether or not the funds raised by the government through the export taxes find their way back into the cashew system and farmers benefit in other ways is something else to be assessed. If we look at the subsidization of exports, I think that my personal opinion, this is not an ACA opinion, it's a very personal opinion, is that subsidies can assist in situations where a fast development of a sector is needed, attraction for investors is needed, and the means to pay for the subsidies are clearly defined and outlined, perhaps through the imposition of an export tax on raw cashew nuts. Subsidies should actually find their way back to farmers, but only at a point when the balance between processing and RCN export. So you have a high tax on RCN export and a subsidy on processing. So at what point does the subsidy find its way back to the farm gate? Only, to my mind, only at the point where processing starts to exceed the export of raw cashew nuts. So for me, subsidization of processing can be very effective short term. So what's short term? 5 years, 7 years perhaps. For new processors, it is, to my mind, not a good idea that already established large businesses that have been in business for many years are subsidized. I find that absolutely pointless. I don't think that does anything for the sector at all. But for new businesses, I think so. Much more important, in my opinion, is that the governments or the sector in general puts in place an environment that processing becomes attractive, that banks want to lend, that investors want to invest, that staff want to work in, and putting that kind of environment in place should in time have a much bigger impact. But of course, that takes much more time than a direct subsidy. And I think the idea of direct subsidies is to spark it, to get the processing going, to prove it can work, create success stories from which others will follow. And don't forget that it is important from a buyer's perspective, a kernel buyer's perspective, that there's scale and that there's quality factories that they can buy from. If they can buy from one, they'll look for another and they'll keep looking. And that can develop and engage buyers in the sector too. So if we look at the last few years, what we've seen is the idea that Africa cannot process is gone. People know that well-managed, well-constructed African factories can do the job. The idea that African cashew kernels will always be inferior is gone, because we have those success stories in various countries doing the job well, doing the job transparently, and marketing in a modern way. So I think there's a balance to be struck between the two.
I may come back to the policy question at some point. Let's take two quick questions. First one, what is the trend of Vietnamese production to the global market, whether it has increased or decreased during COVID? it's more on the production end from Vietnam. And then again, the observation that has been made by a questioner is that kernel prices are higher in Africa now than Vietnam. And how long do you think this will last? These two quick ones, yeah.
First one, okay, so production in Vietnam has been static to falling. Depends on the time period you look over. If you look over 15 years, it's been falling. If you look over the last 5 years, it's been static, up and down within a range, according to the weather conditions and the growing conditions. The Vietnamese sector has, to a certain extent, pinned its hopes on Cambodia. Cambodian production has been rising and will continue to rise. And Vietnam is, I think, hoping that Cambodia will become a localized source of raw cashew nuts. Sometimes people get the mistaken impression that the Vietnamese and Cambodian cashew sectors are, best friends, that they work together, that Vietnam dominates Cambodia. That's not true. Cambodia is also interested to develop its own cashew sector. Cambodia is interested to develop processing. Cambodia has developed high levels of yield, high yielding varieties very successfully. And the idea that's sometimes out there that the Cambodian sector is an extension of Vietnam is not correct. Cambodia can be an important producer. Of course, like most producing countries, it will sell large volumes of raw cashew nuts to Vietnam for the foreseeable future. I would say the prospects in that area are that Vietnamese production is unlikely to change. It's unlikely to increase. Cambodian production will go on increasing probably for the next 5 years. And, it is possible that we will see Cambodian production eventually reach a figure approaching 1 million tons. That's possible. It's not yet. And there's so much misinformation out there. I know it's very difficult for people to read this, but definitely Cambodia will increase. Vietnam will not, to my mind. The second question, kernels prices are certainly higher in African countries for export today than they are elsewhere. That's partly a function of the freight difference. It's a function of diversification of the supply chain. It's a function of all the logistics difficulties and problems. You're from good ports in West Africa, you're less than 3 weeks from New York or Rotterdam. From Vietnam at the moment, it could be as much as 7-8 weeks. And that's a factor that has a value. Also, I think that some of the major exporting factories now, processors in West Africa particularly, have established themselves with good reputations for quality. They've established themselves as interesting businesses with good practice, and they meet a lot of the things that buyers need. And in some areas, in some aspects, such as traceability, such as social compliance, such as environmental compliance, these factories would be ahead of their competitors in Vietnam. And for all of those reasons, we're seeing prices in West Africa for good factories well ahead. I think prices for 320s reached $3.50 at one point, maybe slightly higher than that. They may be slightly lower than that just at the moment, but obviously that's a big premium over the prices available in Vietnam.
So thank you very much. Now let us focus on the demand supply situation, and then take Amit's question, where he's asking, talking of a global picture, is consumption of cashew kernels expected to grow in line with the growth of the cashew crop size? Indeed, which one is growing faster than the other? Is consumption growing faster than the supply, or we have the supply outstripping the consumption?
Well, if we take the trends in consumption over the past 5 years, the conclusion would be that consumption is growing faster than production. And we have to be careful with that because there's always a lag in production. So there will have been, let's say in the period up to 2017, there will have been quite a lot of interest in planting new trees and developing existing trees for better performance. And that will have been ongoing in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria. It will also have been a factor in Cambodia, where production has been rising, and we only see the results of that 5 years later. So the immediate conclusion is that based on the rise in production over the past 5 years, compared to the rise in consumption, that consumption will exceed supply by 2026 significantly. Now, that's what I mean by that is that it will structurally exceed production. In other words, that even in a good year, it's not possible to meet the level of consumption. Obviously, in a bad year, then you'd have volatility. Now, markets have to adapt to that. So you can't consume what's not produced. And normally you would expect, therefore, that the price trend would be upward. We probably will see a reaction to fairly high prices in 2016, 2017, which may well have stimulated further growth in production. And if we think 2017 plus 4 is 2021, plus 5, you start to see some benefits of that in 2022. However, the crash in farm gate prices in 2018, followed by low prices in 19 and 20, would mean that, and I know in certain countries, it has stalled growth in production. So my conclusion, based on the numbers, is that consumption is rising faster than production. Based on the reaction to that, I think that that is going to bite in the market 3 to 4 years from now, and that then will be corrected over the following 5 years. You will eventually find an equilibrium again. It probably means generally that cashew prices are higher for a period. We've seen that over many years. Cashew prices have been fundamentally rising. Despite the volatility, they've been fundamentally rising for about 20 years. Consumption has been rising almost every year since 1985, and production reacts somewhat unpredictably to that. So we're now looking at impacts of price on farmers' actions, but we're also looking at the level of capacity. How possible is it to continue fast growth following 10 years of already what was very fast growth in production? That's why we're seeing a slowdown. And secondly, what is the impact of climate change on production in the coming years? And that may be, it may be a long-term factor, but it's also clear from what we see from various analysis reports is that perhaps some of the impacts of climate change are with us earlier than was originally expected. So is there, if the question is there an opportunity to grow cashews? Will there be a market for them? I'm almost certain that there will be.
Thank you very much, Jim. And now I go back to the policy issues. You're talking about banana skins. You talked about the export window being more or less something that you can consider as a banana skin, and really which hasn't been very effective, and probably even more costly for producing countries. These are obviously attempts by governments to make raw cashew nuts available to local processors to buy before the export competition builds up. What, in your view, has worked elsewhere other than the use of these export windows? Or in your view, what would you advise governments to do? So long as we know it doesn't work, what are the alternatives?
Well, if you want to link processors to farmers, you've got to have processors first of all. So you've got to do something to create an environment that processing will grow. I think we've got to, and it's organizations like ACA and others, governments, we've got to make processors more aware that building integrated supply chains is an important activity, that the buying of cashew kernels is not something, you know, in West Africa, it's not something that you start in February and finish in April. It's something that you have to develop year round. You have to develop relationships. The relationship with your suppliers is not just simply based on price. It's not simply based on the handing over of cash for 2 months of the year. It's based on something more than that and a better connection than that. And that's the way to build an integrated supply chain. So I think it's important that, first of all, that the consciousness and the belief that connecting processors to farmers is important. To do that, you can't connect processors to individual farmers, so you have to give farmers an opportunity to work in groups or to work in cooperatives, organizations, somehow to cluster together to create some negotiating power and something that those processors can work with. And we're talking about smallholders, so processors can't, they can't deal with every farmer individually. There has to be some organization around that, and that seems to work. And that can be, we see in some countries local markets for the sale of raw cashew nuts as a mechanism works. We see that generally, I would say that what's worked are positive incentivization, positive creation of market environments that work, as opposed to strict regulation, because the strict regulation is just too hard to implement. So saying we have to retain 15% or we can't export cashews until the 15th of January, for example, this is very difficult, particularly if the exporter of the RCN and the processor is the same business. And that's just very difficult to manage. So we are better, I think, to make processing work and to link it to farmers and maybe to treat farmers as business people over the long term, encourage them to organize and therefore to interact with the processors. It's not an easy one, because at the same time, you don't want to discourage the export of raw cashew nuts, because that's essential, obviously. But at the moment, given the market conditions, we're in a situation where all the raw cashew nuts grown in the world are needed every year. And sometimes I think that the legacy of 15 to 20 years ago, when raw cashew nut prices were as low at one stage as $150 a ton, that the legacy of that still hangs over policymakers and over markets. That's not going to happen again. We've now got highly developed industry, much higher levels of production and consumption. And I think that positive enabling policies are likely to be more effective. The idea of export windows is based on the fact that processors will be A, capable of buying, B, will want to buy, and C, will be active in the market when the RCN exporters are not. But the fact is that in a lot of countries, the processor and the exporter of RCN is one and the same person, one and the same business, that the measurement of whether or not the product has been retained is almost impossible. So, what seems to be, this is a very personal opinion, so bear with it, but what seems to be a good idea on paper, in reality, just doesn't work, or it comes in at a time when the market needs it, but persists beyond its need. So you have a situation where, you have an auction system, for example, which came in at a time when raw cashew nut prices were very low and something needed to be done to assist farmers to get better value for the product they were growing. But it persisted beyond its time, and it turned into a very complex, overly costly, clumsy marketing mechanism in a market which anyway needed the raw cashew nuts and was particularly likely to buy high quality raw cashew nuts like those grown in Tanzania.
Thank you, Jim. Earlier on, we talked about the relatively high price of kernels in Africa compared to, say, Vietnam today. And the questioner wants to know why Vietnam, in spite of a relatively lower kernel price, is able to, or processing is able to survive there, thrive there. Whereas in Africa, where the prices are comparatively better, processors in Africa are struggling.
Okay, well, first of all, let's just get a couple of things straight. This is a very new phenomenon. So it will, at this point, have had no impact on the processing sector in general. It will have had an impact on individual businesses who've been smart enough or lucky enough or talented enough to be ready to take advantage of this situation. If I look at it from the point of view of the buyer, yes, African FOB prices are higher, but freight from Africa is lower. So actually, are they really paying a higher price for the product delivered to their factory? They may not be. Why are Vietnamese factories able to manage with lower prices? Well, really it's the other way around. Vietnam sets the market and everyone else follows one way and another. So first of all, in Vietnam, they're large scale, highly efficient factories, long developed with effective management, high productivity, good machines, high levels of capital investment, all of those things that you would expect from modern businesses. And because of those factors, they're able to keep their costs under control. So their model may well be that they process bigger volumes at lower margins. In African countries, factories tend to be smaller. They've tended to be less well managed, less well capitalized, and therefore their costs generally are likely to be higher. Then we should add in that there are some factors that are beyond the control of African factories, perhaps the cost of electricity, perhaps the number of outlets for byproducts, perhaps the cost of logistics, packaging materials, and so on. And it's also possible that local managers and staff are not necessarily available simply because it's a new industry. So there's cost of training staff and sometimes the cost of bringing in trainers or managers from outside the country. So there are a whole range of factors which mean that overall processing costs in African countries are higher. But don't forget that's balanced against the fact that the raw material is much closer by, that they don't have to pay any of the taxes on export for the raw material, that they are able to, if they want, develop direct links with farmers to establish certified supply chains too. So it's about scale, it's about the development of a business, it's about a new business versus a well-established business, and it's about the new business having some advantages which the well-established business doesn't have, things like traceability, integrated supply chain, and whether or not the new business, that is the African processing sector, can present those benefits and opportunities in a way that can make it viable and from which it can make a profit.
Thank you very much, Jim. And these are all the questions that we have. And it's been a pleasure having you today. And I will invite your concluding remarks and also what to look out for the next fortnight, which I know is on the 20th of October, 2021. So Jim, back to you again here.
Thanks, Ernest. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you for the questions. They're really good questions and difficult enough to get to conclusions on them. The next time we're going to be talking about markets and marketing. So I'm going to talk then about, again, we'll come back and we look at the markets as they develop over the next 2 weeks, but we'll also talk about the importance of good marketing, what buyers are looking for, and how the African cashew sector can give them that. In conclusion, I think over the next 2 weeks, it'll be very interesting to see how the Tanzanian auction starts out. I would be keeping a close eye on the price of cashew kernels from Vietnam, particularly the range in prices. So when you see prices, look at the price from the top processor and look at the price from down the line, the cheapest processor, and look to see if that is widening out. So at the moment, it has widened out quite a bit. There's a big range between the top processor and the smaller processor. If you see that widening out, it might be a signal that kernels prices are going to come down a little bit. At the same time, if you're an African processor, stay in touch with your customers. There may well be interesting opportunities for last minute orders for European buyers or North American buyers. And they may be some of the most rewarding orders of the year. Also, I think we all of us need to keep a close eye on how the COVID situation develops. We're coming into the winter in the Northern Hemisphere. Last winter, we saw a big spike in COVID cases. Different situation a year on with vaccinations and so on. See how that happens. And by the way, I'll just add, if anyone is going to the Enugu Trade Fair, I'd love to meet you. I'll be there next week. Drop me a line and we can meet up. Thanks very much, everyone. I look forward to talking to you again in a couple of weeks. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you. So we come your way again next with the next session on the 20th of October 2021. Big thank you to Jim and to all of you participants. Stay in the background, do your networking, and don't forget to leave any questions that are still lingering on. We will try and address them in another session. And we also say a big thank you to our sponsors and partners, and bye-bye to all of you. Bye. Please stay safe. Bye-bye.
De plus de 60 milliards de francs CFA par campagne agricole, plus du quart de la production mondiale et près de la moitié de l'offre mondiale de noix brutes de cajou. Un immense potentiel de création d'emplois et de richesses.
Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy now of the ACA Cashew Barometer.